Hello, and welcome to English Digest. I'm Seb.
And I'm Elsie.
And we're back with another translation unit. But first, I have a question for you, Elsie. Do you consider yourself a hard worker?
我是不是努力工作的人啊? I think so. At least I'm always a responsible teacher.
I see, because I really need some help about planning my time efficiently.
Really?
Since lockdown started, I've really struggled with procrastination. Procrastination, that's 拖延. It's when you avoid doing the work you need to do by doing other things. That could be having fun, or, hanging out with friends, or it could be doing less important jobs or smaller jobs rather than big ones that you're worried about. So, for example, the day that I wrote my script for this TP, I was supposed to be doing some other homework, which was very hard, but I didn't want to do it, so I planned this TP instead. That's procrastination. So how can I plan my time better?
所以你有拖延病. Actually, you know what? I'm like that too. So recently, I've been trying to write down what I need to do on the little whiteboard at home. And I think that helps a little.
A whiteboard, that's a very good idea. Whiteboard is 白板. It's the, what you use in the classroom to write down notes and things like that. So I've not thought of that. I'm going to give that a go. I think one of the struggles that I have with lockdown is there's so much time in the day, but also the day feels so short. I'm at home all the time, so it's really hard for me to organize my time well. In our first sentence for today, however, it looks like students in Taiwan have a different problem. They're too busy. Let's take a closer look, shall we? Okay, so our first sentence the first sentence of our first translation for today is, in Taiwan, studying for exams takes up too much of high school students' time and leaves them with little time to pursue hobbies and leisure activities.
今天呢，我们要翻译的句子中文是在台湾为了考试而读书占据了中学生太多的时间，而且呢，让他们少有时间能够追求兴趣跟休闲活动。This is very true.
Exactly. And this makes me think of that complaint that I was always making in high school. We'd say, when am I going to use this in real life? When you were in math class and you're learning a complicated equation, or you're learning, I don't know, some French, or, a historical battle. You think, when am I going to need this?
Or geography or difficult science.
Exactly.
好了，那这边呢，我们的时态要用的是现在简单式描述事实。占据、占用时间，我们除了用 take up 之外呢，也可以用动词 occupy。所以呢，例句给同学咯。The video game she was playing occupied Carla's entire afternoon。代表呢 ，Carla 玩的电动占掉了她一整个下午的时间。
Wow, it sounds like that video game was very time-consuming. When something is time-consuming, it takes up a lot of time, normally in a bad way. That's why I don't let myself play video games, actually, because I have no time control. So another example would be in Taipei, the traffic is often very, very bad. So getting around in a car can be very time-consuming. In other words, it takes longer to get around in a car than it should. So what's something you think is too time-consuming in your day-to-day life?
I think, like you said, going to work is kind of time-consuming if I have to take the bus and then take the MRT and then I have to walk to the office. That's time-consuming to me. 所以 time-consuming 这个形容词呢，是个复合形容词，代表的是耗费时间的。那接下来呢，我们要表达的是让。这个让在这边有使点点点处于某状态的意思。句型呢，我们用 leave 这个动词加上受词之后，后面呢有几种选择给各位。第一个是加上形容词，第二个是加上 VING， 第三个是加上过去分词，第四个是加上介系词片语。For example, learning that she had won a major prize for her work left Jennifer speechless. 这边加的就是一个形容词的用法。听到自己的作品得到首奖，让珍妮佛 Jennifer 说不出话来。
I'm really glad that you brought up that structure. That's a great structure to remember. There are a lot of other phrases we can use to talk about the effects and consequences, though. One is wind up with something. When we wind up with something, we end up with that situation or effect, normally without meaning to. Wind up has a negative connotation. So, for example, we would say, I wound up spending 1 hour at the supermarket because it was so busy. That gives us the idea that we didn't mean to spend that long at the supermarket. Sadly, though, we did. We could also talk about ending up with something that's got a similar connotation as well.
OK, 再来呢，我们要表示少。那在这边呢 time 时间当然不可数，所以呢表示数量少，我们要用 little 而不是 few。因为 few 后面必须要加上的是可数名词。那另外呢，句子当中的少有，它不是较少，所以呢，它不是比较级。那我们不能用 less 这个字。
So time to pursue hobbies and activities. That sounds like time to ourselves. I think it's very important that we have enough time to ourselves. Time to yourself is another way of saying leisure time. It's the time that you don't have to spend with other people. It's the time that you don't have to do homework, do jobs, time when it's just you on your own and you can relax. It's very important to have you time. Why is it important to you, Elsie, that you have you time?
I think I do have enough me time to do what I want to do after work or before work.But I don't mind having more time in my life.
Yes. I think you can always have a little bit more you time.
Yes.
I certainly wish I had more me time right now. Okay, let's look at this word pursue now.
Okay. 所以呢，我们要表达追求要用哪一个动词呢？我们要用的是 pursue， 注意它的拼法是 P-U-R-S-U-E。那名词 pursuit。P-U-R-S-U-I-T 它也有追求的意思。那本句最后呢，我们可以翻作 leaves them little time for the pursuit of hobbies and leisure activities. 那再给同学们一个例句哦。The people are holding these protests in pursuit of a more free and just society. 代表这些人为了追求一个更自由而且公正的社会而发起抗争 in pursuit of.Okay,
let's move on to our second sentence now. Remember, our first sentence was, in Taiwan, studying for exams takes up too much of high school students' time and leaves them with little time to pursue hobbies and leisure activities. Our second sentence is, this can lead to negative consequences, as it is hard for students to comprehend the true meaning of life from textbooks.
第二个我们要翻译的句子呢，中文是这可能会导致负面的结果，因为学生难以从课本当中领悟到生命的真谛。
A good phrase to remember from this sentence is negative consequences. A negative consequence is a bad effect of something. So lung cancer, for example, is a negative consequence of smoking. Come to think of it, I can't think of any positive consequences of smoking. I guess you get to spend a lot of times on your own because you smell like tobacco and nobody wants to stand near you.
And you can release some pressure.Yeah,
I'm just joking, guys. Don't smoke. There's no good side to smoking. Moving on, while we're on talking about smoking, we've got to keep talking about negative consequences. If you get negative consequences because of something bad you did, then we often say that you have to face the consequences, which means deal with the consequences yourself. Face here is a verb that means 面临. So we get a good aphorism for this. Remember aphorisms from our previous month's episode, those general sayings that have a truth about life. Anyway, the aphorism that we can use here is, you've made your bed, now lie in it. Okay, so that means if you did something that you knew would have bad consequences or that people know have bad consequences, now you have to deal with those consequences yourself. So if you didn't study for the test, you have to deal with the fact that you got a bad grade. It's your fault. You have to deal with the situation.
也就是自食其果，所以刚刚 Seb 提到的这个 aphorism 就是我们之前有讨论过的格言。那这里呢，我们翻译的句子时态要使用的是现在简单式，因为在描述的是事实。那在此呢，你要注意哦，中文虽然说学生难以，但你千万不可以 就把英文的句子当中学生拿来当主词，然后后面直接说 students are difficult or students are hard， 然后接下去说，这样是不对的。因为呢，困难的是从课本当中领悟到生命的真谛这件事，所以在翻译的时候，你必须要以虚主词为首，然后呢，加上动词 is 之后加形容词，再加上 for somebody 以及 to， 再加上一个原形动词，才可以把真正的主词呢置于不定词之后。那再来，我们要表示领悟到，也就是充分的理解，层次是高于知道，高于 understand 这个字，所以我们动词呢，除了可以用 comprehend 之外，还可以用到 grasp. So for example, it took me a while to grasp the teacher's meaning, but I get it now. 我刚才花了一点时间去理解老师的意思，但我现在懂了。
Okay, so as Elsie explained, grasp means understand. However, there are lots of other words we can use that have a similar meaning. One phrase I like to use when I'm learning something new is get to grips with. This means to come to understand something new. For example, this computer program is quite complicated, so it was a few days before I got to grips with it. Or it took me a while to get to grips with it. When you tighten your grip on something, that's different. We're not talking about understanding something anymore. We're talking about controlling something. So it means to gain more control over. As in, when that country's government passed a law banning free speech, it tightened its grip on the people.
再来呢，我们要表示的是真谛，也就是真正的意义。那我们可以视上下文译作 the true meaning 或是 the true spirit or the true value of something. So for example, Vaughn didn't understand the true value of friendship until he no longer had it. 直到 Vaughn 不再拥有友谊的时候，他才明白它真正的价值。
It sounds like Vaughn took his friends for granted. When we take something for granted, we don't appreciate its true worth. For granted, by the way, is two words, so it's F-O-R space granted. So, for example, Billy takes his mum for granted. She does so much for him and he never says thank you. One day, he'll regret that. Okay, so here what Billy is doing is he is just assuming his mum will always do nice things for him. She will always do stuff for him, so he doesn't need to say thank you. He's taking her for granted. We can also take things for granted too. If you take money for granted, for example, you just assume that you will always have money and you won't think that money is important. Elsie, have you ever taken something or someone for granted?
I used to take my mom for granted when I was maybe in high school and in college, thinking that she had to do everything for me, but I was wrong. So to take somebody for granted 代表是将某人视为理所当然 To take something for granted 代表将某事物视为理所当然
Very good points there. Okay, let's take a quick break here and then we can move on to the second part of our translation exercise. Okay, so we're back with our second translation, and this time we're talking about climate. Okay, so climate, remember, is just kind of the general conditions in the weather in a place. Okay, so Taiwan has a subtropical climate, for example. It doesn't have very cold winters and very hot summers. It has a long warm period and a short cold period. So that's different to, say, the climate in the UK, which it's called a maritime climate. Which just means that it rains all the time. And it's cold. It's cold and it rains all the time.
Cold and rainy.
So it's a boring, not nice climate that we have in the UK. So different climates in different places. So our sentence here is looking at climate change and the impact of climate change on Taiwan. Okay? So the sentence is, due to the lack of rainfall in the past year, water levels in Taiwan's reservoirs hit an unprecedented low point in the first half of 2021.
好，所以 Part B 第一个句子呢，我们在讨论的是关于 climate 气候的事情，还有气候带来的 impact 冲击跟影响。那由于呢过去一年缺乏降雨，所以台湾水库的水位在2021年上半年达到空前的新低点。
Okay, so we saw the word reservoir there, which I think is a really good one. A reservoir is basically, as Elsie said, it's a 水库. So it's a fake lake, basically. A big artificial lake or man-made lake that is used to store water for a place or to generate electricity. So you might have heard of a thing called hydroelectric dams or just dams, which are big kind of walls they might put in a reservoir which generate electricity when the water runs through. It's a kind of green energy. So you'll see this word being used a lot, I think especially in Taiwan, as Taiwan is trying to become more climate friendly or more environmentally friendly. It seems like this story, though, this story of the lack of rain, is one more about global warming. We often talk about melting ice in the Arctic and rising sea levels when we discuss global warming. However, there are lots of different weather effects that come from it. One is severe droughts and floods. So certain parts of the world may experience much less rain in the future. Others might experience much more. Do you think the drought this year was caused by global warming, Elsie?
Maybe, but actually I'm not quite sure. 那这边呢，我们要用的时态啊，注意哦，我们要用的是过去式来描述过去发生的事情。因为呢，刚刚的中文你也知道，它在讲的是过去一年的状况。那缺乏、缺少，我们可以用 a lack of 来表示。相同的用法还有 a shortage of。那注意哦。lack 它如果是名词的话，后面常常接的是介系词 of。那如果它做动词的话，你可以在后面直接加上缺少的人或物是什么，你就不需要介系词了。So, for example, the students lack confidence, so they might be shy about speaking in front of people. 学生缺乏自信，所以他们也许会在对人群前面说话的这件事情感到羞怯。那这一句我们也可以说成 The students have a lack of confidence, so they might be shy about speaking in front of people.
Okay, that's a very good example. I think we all lack confidence from time to time. When we lack confidence, we don't have courage or we don't believe in ourselves. However, if you challenge yourself and try new things and move outside your comfort zone, you may find that you don't lack confidence so much anymore. We call this personal growth. It's the development of you and your character into a more confident, more mature person. So a personal example I'd like to share with you guys is I used to get very nervous when speaking in public. So, giving speeches, things like that. So I decided to enter a public speaking competition in Japanese.
用日文, wow!
Yes, it was very scary because I had to do it at the Japanese embassy for the Japanese ambassador to Spain. I was in Spain at that time.
哇，还要到大使馆去。
Yes, so it was very scary, but it taught me a lot about being on stage and what I could achieve when I trusted myself to just be myself. And I actually won the competition.
Nice.
Yeah, so if you just trust yourself, you can actually surprise yourself with the things that you can do. One of my teachers gave me some very good advice about it, actually. They said, you might not be able to make yourself confident immediately. That's fine. Just fake it till you make it. So fake it till you make it means if you don't feel confident, for example, you can pretend to be confident and people will believe you're confident. And pretty soon, you're going to feel confident too. Because when you present in a certain way, you will start to feel that way.
所以 fake it till you make it 代表是假装到你成功为止。OK, 再来呢，我们要看到的是达到该怎么样来表示。动词 hit在这边呢就有达到高点或低点的意思。那类似的用法呢，我们还可以用 reach 或者是 come to 这两个。So for example, local temperatures reached a record high this summer and they've expected to keep rising. 代表当地的气温在今年夏天达到历史新高，而且呢预计还会持续攀升。
Okay, so reach here is a great word for talking about weather, graphs, statistical data, because we use this word to talk about changes in value, things increasing or things decreasing. There are some other words we can look at too. I just want to point out one for going up and one for going down. Soar to. So soar is S-O-A-R, and it means normally for a bird to fly high in the sky. So when we talk about a number, say temperatures soaring to a certain value, we mean that they went up very, very high. The opposite of this is plummet to. So plummet is another flying-related word. When something plummets, it falls to the ground very, very quickly. So if temperatures plummet, they fall or they decrease by a lot. So sometimes during the winter in Taiwan, the temperatures can plummet from, say, 20 degrees to 5 degrees over the course of a couple of days.
所以呢 soar to 代表创新高 plummet to 代表创新低，都是很实用的用法哦。那再来呢，空前的我们要怎么样表示呢？我们可以用到形容词 unprecedented， 那它是来自名词 precedent， 也就是先例、前例。那空前的概念呢，可以理解是达到历史上的最低点，所以呢，我们也可以翻作 hit the lowest point in history。再给同学们一个例句咯。The amount of wealth owned by the world's richest people is unprecedented in history. 代表世界上最富有的人所拥有的财富总额是历史上的新高。
Unprecedented. That's a great, very dramatic use of English. Unprecedented means never happened before. So when we're talking about the weather, such as in the translation sentence, we could also use the phrase since records began. So what was the worst drought since records began? It's difficult to say, but one terrible drought was the Dust Bowl, and it happened in 1930s America. I think it was in Nebraska and Oklahoma, and those central states. So basically what happened at this time was the weather was extremely dry and brought severe dust storms to the center of the US. And the storms made it impossible for farmers there to grow any food, and soon there was an enormous famine. There was lots of hunger. It was one of the great natural disasters of US history. So I think from here we can move on to our second sentence, which is what basically the Taiwanese government plans to do about this drought. The Water Resources Agency, so that's a government agency, said if the drought persisted, it would adopt stricter water rationing measures. This is an interesting thing, actually, because in the UK, we often struggle with droughts, funnily enough, in the summer, because even though it rains a lot, we're not normally ready for there to not be rain, because we expect the rain to come a lot. So often we have a measure called a hosepipe ban, which is when there's a law that you can't use hoses on your gardens. You can't water your plants using the hoses, because that's wasted water. And we normally do this in the summer to stop people from wasting water, so we can save more water for more important uses.
Okay, so different governments have different ways to deal with the problem, right? 那这边呢，我们的中文呢，说到的是水利署表示呢，如果干旱持续的话，他们将采取更严格的限水措施。那时态呢，注意哦，我们要用到的是过去式，描述过去发生的事情。那干旱我们说是 drought， 也可以译为 water shortage， 也就是缺水的意思。
We already talked a bit about droughts in our previous sentence, but drought isn't the only natural disaster word that you guys need to know. Let's review some others. So a flood is the opposite of a drought. That is a 水灾, when lots of water falls from the sky, when there's lots of rain. And I feel like we almost had a flood. We had a flood last week in Taiwan.
Right, we did.
We had a drought and then a flood, so they often come together, actually.
Yeah.
A famine, I mentioned that one before, is when there's no food for people to eat. We could also talk about epidemics or pandemics. Pandemics are when a disease spreads across the whole world, like COVID. COVID is a pandemic, eating. An epidemic is a local pandemic. So, for example, SARS in 2003 was an epidemic because it didn't go to the whole world. It was just very dangerous in Asia. And lastly, we have a tsunami. Tsunami is basically a giant wave that comes in from the sea and causes lots of destruction along the coast.
OK， 好多非常实用的字都很重要。Epidemic 它指的是地区性的流行病，那 pandemic 指的就是全球性的流行病。Tsunami 就是海啸了哈，很久以前呢有一个南亚大海啸，不知道同学们知不知道？那再来呢，我们要表示持续的时候，我们可以用到 persist 这个动词，也可以使用 continue、go on 或是 carry on 来代替。For example, the rain will carry on through the weekend, so we should plan some indoor activities. 这场雨呢会持续整个周末，所以我们应该要规划一些室内的活动。
That rain sounds pretty persistent. Persistent is the adjective form of persist. So when something is persistent, it exists for a longer time than usual or continuously. We also saw the word adopt, didn't we?
Right, adopt 它叫做采取，那也可以用其他的动词形式，像是 apply、employ 或者是 follow 或是 implement 来替换。那值得注意的是呢，不可以将 adopt 跟 adapt 混淆哦。adapt adapt 它有改编或是适应的意思。那还有一个很相似的字叫做 adept adapt 它代表的是熟练的。Okay, for example, my mom employs a low, firm voice to let me know that I'm in trouble. 代表我妈妈发出一种低沉而且坚定的声音，让我知道我麻烦大了。
We also saw that the government is going to be using some water rationing measures, aren't they? They're going to be controlling the amount of water there is.
限水呢就是定额配水，英文我们会说 water rationing。那如果表示限量供应、限电的话呢，英文就会是 electricity or power rationing。
Well, I hope that they don't have to do any water rationing, because rationing, as Elsie explained, is a process by which a country or organization limits the amount of resources people can use. One of the most famous examples of rationing in the UK was food rationing, and this happened during and after World War II. Under food rationing, people were given special books called ration books that had stamps in them. The stamps were valid for specific weeks and could be exchanged with money for certain amounts of meat, cheese, bread, and other things. Because the UK's economy was damaged so much by World War II, the government had to keep the rationing policy for almost 10 years after the war ended. Rationing wasn't a lot of fun, and people really hated it.
Okay, 所以除了配水、定额配水、定额配电，还有配给食物的时候也会发生这样的事情，叫做 food rationing.
Exactly. So, unfortunately, that's the end of our lesson today. Let's go through the 4 sentences again, shall we?
Okay.
In Taiwan, studying for exams takes up too much of high school students' time and leaves them with little time to pursue hobbies and leisure activities. This can lead to negative consequences, as it is hard for students to comprehend the true meaning of life from textbooks. Due to the lack of rainfall in the past year, water levels in Taiwan's reservoirs hit an unprecedented low point in the first half of 2021. The Water Resources Agency said if the drought persisted, it would adopt stricter water rationing measures. Okay, so I hope you guys learned something from today's translation activity. I certainly did.
I did too. I learned a lot.
But unfortunately, it's time for us to wrap up. So for English Digest, I'm Seb.
I'm Elsie.
And we'll see you again soon. Bye-bye.
Bye.